The gas station clerk's eyes held the kind of wariness Hannah had learned to recognize in her years as a social worker, the look of someone who'd seen too much and spoke too little about it. She set her trail mix and water bottles on the counter, noting how his gaze lingered on her hiking gear. "You heading up into the mountains?" His voice carried a mountain drawl thick as molasses. "Just a few days. Need to clear my head." Hannah forced a smile, the kind she'd perfected for difficult clients and supervisors alike. 3 months of leave stretched ahead of her, and she intended to spend every minute of it as far from civilization as possible. The clerk, his name tag read Earl, rang up her purchases with deliberate slowness. "Whereabouts you planning to go?" Found an interesting trail in an old hiking journal. "Ridgeway Trail. It's supposed to connect to the Appalachian Trail somewhere near." Earl's hands stilled on the register. "Where'd you hear about Ridgeway?" Something in his tone made Hannah's social worker instincts prickle. She'd heard that same careful neutrality from children trying not to reveal family secrets. "Like I said, an old journal. Found it in a ranger station that looked like it hadn't been used in years." Earl leaned forward, his weathered hands gripping the counter. "Miss, I've been living in these mountains my whole life, 63 years come December. My daddy worked for the Forest Service, and his daddy before him. Ridgeway Trail was closed back in '79. Closed? It's not marked as closed on any. Wouldn't be. Some things the government just stops talking about instead of making a fuss." Earl's eyes darted toward the windows where late afternoon shadows stretched long across the parking lot. "You seem like a nice lady." "Take my advice. Stick to the marked trails. Plenty of beautiful country that way." Hannah felt her jaw tighten. After months of being told what she should and shouldn't do, by supervisors, by the department psychologists, by well-meaning friends, she wasn't about to let a gas station clerk dictate her hiking plans. "I appreciate the concern, but I'm an experienced hiker. I can handle myself." Earl studied her for a long moment, then reached under the counter. He pulled out a faded topographical map, the kind with hand-drawn annotations in the margins. "This here's the real lay of the land. See this area?" He pointed to a section where the green shading seemed darker, more dense. "That's where Ridgeway runs. Used to be a logging road. Then the CCC made it into a proper trail back in the '30s. Hannah leaned in despite herself. The map showed terrain she hadn't seen on any official charts, steep ravines, unmarked peaks, and what looked like abandoned structures scattered throughout the area. What happened in '79? Earl folded the map carefully, his movements precise. Folks started going missing. Hikers mostly, but some local kids too. Rangers found camps that looked like they'd been abandoned in a hurry, food still warm, sleeping bags scattered. Sometimes they'd find personal effects hung in trees like Christmas ornaments. The afternoon light filtering through the windows seemed to dim as he spoke. Hannah found herself checking the parking lot, though she couldn't say why. The state sent in search teams, even brought in some federal boys with their fancy equipment. Found exactly nothing. Trail just got quiet after that. Park Service stopped maintaining it, stopped putting it on the maps. Most folks forgot it was ever there. Hannah straightened, pushing down the chill that had crept up her spine. "You're trying to scare me." "No, ma'am. I'm trying to keep you alive." Earl's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "If you're fool enough to go up there anyway, you remember this. If you hear whistling at night, don't whistle back. Don't matter how pretty the tune is. Don't matter if it sounds like your mama calling you home. You hear whistling, you pack up and you get out." The bell above the door chimed as another customer entered, a young man in hunting gear who nodded to Earl and headed toward the beer cooler. The moment of intensity broke, leaving Hannah feeling slightly foolish. "Thanks for the advice," she said, gathering her purchases, "but I think I'll be fine." Earl handed her the receipt, his fingers brushing hers. They were ice cold despite the warm afternoon. "The trailhead is about 12 miles up Route 191. You'll see a rusted gate with a no trespassing sign. That's where it starts." He paused. "And miss, when you change your mind about going up there, not if, when, you come back through here. I'll be here until 10 tonight." Hannah left the gas station with Earl's words echoing in her mind, but her resolve remained firm. She'd dealt with genuine monsters in her work, men who hurt children, systems that failed the vulnerable, bureaucrats who cared more about statistics than lives. Whatever might be lurking in the mountains, couldn't be worse than what she'd already seen. The drive up Route 191 took her through increasingly remote territory. Modern houses gave way to double-wide trailers, then to ramshackle cabins that looked like they'd been built from salvaged materials. She passed a few locals walking along the roadside, men in work clothes who watched her rental car with undisguised curiosity, women hanging laundry who stopped their work to stare. The sun was setting when she found the trailhead, exactly where Earl had said it would be. The gate was indeed rusted, hanging from broken hinges. The no trespassing sign was so faded she could barely make out the words. Beyond it, an overgrown path disappeared into dense forest. Hannah parked and shouldered her pack, checking her gear one final time. Water purification tablets, camp stove, first aid kit, GPS unit, cell phone, though she doubted she'd have service up here. Everything a responsible solo hiker needed. She approached the gate and noticed something Earl hadn't mentioned. Symbols carved into the metal posts. Not graffiti exactly, but deliberate markings that looked almost like a primitive alphabet. They'd been painted over once, but the paint had weathered away, leaving the cuts clearly visible. The forest beyond the gate was eerily quiet. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Even the insects seemed subdued. Hannah hesitated for just a moment, Earl's warning echoing in her mind. Then she stepped through the gate and into the gathering darkness. The trail was more overgrown than she'd expected, but still passable. Branches had encroached from both sides, creating a tunnel effect that made the path feel claustrophobic. Her flashlight beam revealed decades of accumulated leaf litter and the occasional glimpse of old trail markers, metal blazes so corroded they were barely recognizable. She hiked for about an hour before the path began to climb more steeply. The trees here were different from the ones near the road. Older, thicker, with bark that seemed almost black in her flashlight beam. Some bore scars that looked like claw marks, though she couldn't imagine what animal would have made them. Hannah had planned to hike until she found a good camping spot, but as the darkness deepened, she began to feel exposed on the trail. Every snap of a twig, every whisper of wind through the leaves made her turn and shine her light into the forest. She saw nothing, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each step. When she found a small clearing about 50 feet off the trail, she decided to make camp. The spot was level and sheltered by a ring of massive oaks, their trunks so wide she couldn't have wrapped her arms around them. She set up her tent quickly, working by headlamp, and got her camp stove going for a simple dinner of instant noodles. The warmth of the food and the familiar routine of camp life helped settle her nerves. She was just being paranoid, she told herself. Too many years of expecting the worst in people had made her jumpy in situations where she should be relaxed. She was cleaning her bowl when she heard it. A whistle, clear and melodic, drifting through the trees from somewhere deeper in the forest. It was a simple tune, the kind a person might whistle while walking, cheerful, almost carefree. For a moment Hannah found herself wanting to whistle back, to acknowledge the presence of another person in this lonely place. Earl's warning stopped her cold. The whistling continued for perhaps 30 seconds, then faded away. Hannah sat perfectly still, listening, but heard nothing except the normal sounds of night in the forest, owls hooting in the distance, the rustle of nocturnal creatures in the underbrush. Just another hiker, she told herself. Someone camping nearby who was as surprised to hear human presence as she was. But even as she thought it, she knew it wasn't true. The whistle had come from too deep in the forest, from terrain that looked impassable even by daylight. She banked her camp stove and crawled into her tent, zipping the fly closed. Through the mesh windows, she could see her campsite bathed in pale moonlight. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. Hannah lay in her sleeping bag, listening to the forest sounds, and tried to convince herself she was just being paranoid. But sleep was a long time coming, and when it finally took her, her dreams were filled with the sound of whistling that seemed to come from every direction at once. Hannah woke to absolute silence. Not the normal quiet of early morning in the mountains, but a complete absence of sound that felt almost physical. No bird calls, no insect buzzing, no whisper of wind through leaves. Even her own breathing seemed muffled, as if the air itself was absorbing sound. She checked her watch, 6:47 a.m. Sunrise should have brought the forest alive with activity, but the world outside her tent remained eerily still. Hannah dressed quickly and emerged from her tent to find her campsite exactly as she'd left it, except for one detail that made her blood run cold. Her boots, which she'd left beside the tent entrance, had been moved. Not far, just a few feet to the left, and they'd been placed with military precision, toes pointing directly toward the trail. She stood motionless, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved in the gray dawn light, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Hannah grabbed her boots and checked them carefully before putting them on. No obvious signs of tampering, no foreign objects inside, but they felt different somehow, lighter, as if something had been removed rather than added. Breaking camp took longer than usual because she kept pausing to listen, to watch the forest for any sign of movement. The silence was beginning to feel oppressive, unnatural. She'd hiked in dozens of wilderness areas, and even the quietest mornings had some ambient sound. When she finally shouldered her pack and returned to the trail, Hannah noticed something that made her question her memory of the previous evening. About 20 feet ahead, one of the massive oaks bore a symbol carved deep into its bark, a circle with intersecting lines that looked like a crude star. The cuts were old, darkened with age, but she was certain it hadn't been there when she'd made camp. Hannah approached the tree and ran her fingers over the carving. The bark had grown around the edges, suggesting the symbol was years old, maybe decades, but she would have noticed something this prominent when she'd been choosing her campsite, wouldn't she? The trail beyond the carved tree was clearer than it had been the night before, as if someone had been doing maintenance work. Fallen branches that she remembered stepping over were gone, and the encroaching vegetation seemed to have been pushed back. Hannah told herself it was just morning light making everything look different, but the explanation felt hollow. She hiked for 2 hours through forest that remained unnaturally quiet. Every few hundred yards, she encountered another carved tree, sometimes the same star symbol, sometimes variations that looked like primitive letters or numbers. The carvings were always on the right side of the trail, always at exactly her eye level. At 9:30, Hannah stopped for a break at what had once been a proper camping area. Concrete fire rings and the remains of picnic tables suggested this had been an official campground, probably dating back to when Ridgeway was actively maintained. Now it was overgrown with weeds and small saplings, but she could still make out the ghost of old tent pads. She was drinking water and studying her map when she heard voices. They were distant but clear, carrying through the still air with unusual clarity. A man and woman having what sounded like a normal conversation about hiking plans and weather conditions. Hannah felt a flood of relief. Other hikers meant she wasn't alone up here, meant the eerie atmosphere was just her imagination running wild. She called out, "Hello, are you folks on the trail?" The voices stopped immediately. Hannah waited, listening, but heard nothing more. She called again, louder this time, and thought she heard movement in the trees ahead, footsteps on dry leaves, branches being pushed aside. But no one appeared, and no one answered. Feeling foolish but increasingly uneasy, Hannah packed up and continued hiking. The trail began to climb more steeply, following what looked like an old logging road that had been converted to footpath. The trees here were different, younger, suggesting this area had been clear-cut at some point and allowed to regrow. It was in this second-growth forest that Hannah made a discovery that changed everything. She'd been hiking for about an hour when she spotted something incongruous hanging from a tree branch about 15 feet ahead. At first glance, it looked like camping gear, a bright red stuffed sack or sleeping bag. But as she got closer, details became clearer, and her social worker training kicked in with a sick recognition. It was a child's backpack, a small red school bag with cartoon characters on it, hanging from a branch by its straps about 8 feet off the ground. The pack was weathered but not ancient, maybe a few years old at most. Hannah stared at it for a long moment, her mind racing through possibilities. A family hiking trip where something fell from a pack and got caught in the tree. But the placement was too deliberate, too careful. Someone had put it there intentionally. She found a long branch and managed to hook the backpack, bringing it down carefully. The zippers were corroded but still functional. Inside she found items that made her stomach clench. A child's water bottle with a faded Disney princess design, a small bag of trail mix that had gone moldy, a notebook with drawings of stick figures holding hands, and, most disturbing of all, a driver's license belonging to someone named Jennifer Morrison, age 34, from Charlotte, North Carolina. The license had been issued in 1998 and showed a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. There was also a photo tucked inside the license sleeve, the same woman with a little girl who looked about 7 years old, both of them grinning at the camera in front of what looked like a hiking trail sign. Hannah's hands were shaking as she put the items back in the pack. This wasn't random trail litter. Someone had taken these things from a woman and child, had deliberately placed them here as some kind of marker or warning. She was about to shoulder the pack and continue when she heard it again, the whistling from the night before. But this time it wasn't coming from deep in the forest. This time it was close, just off the trail to her left, and it was accompanied by something that made her blood freeze. Footsteps, deliberate, careful footsteps moving parallel to the trail, keeping pace with her but staying hidden in the trees. Hannah stood perfectly still, listening. The whistling stopped, but the footsteps continued for a few more seconds before they too fell silent. She strained to see into the dense undergrowth, but could make out nothing more than shadows and shapes that might have been trees or might have been something else entirely. "I know you're there," she called out, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "If you need help, just come out and we can talk." No response, but somehow the quality of the silence had changed, become more focused, more aware. Whatever was out there was listening to her as intently as she was listening to it. Hannah made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Instead of turning back, instead of hiking out to her car and driving straight to the nearest police station, she continued forward. Her social worker instincts told her that someone, possibly a child, might be in trouble up here. The backpack suggested people had gone missing, and if there was even a chance someone needed help, she couldn't just walk away. But she wasn't stupid about it. Hannah pulled out her GPS unit and marked her current location, then sent a text message to her sister back in Asheville on Ridgeway Trail. "If you don't hear from me by tomorrow evening, call the police and give them these coordinates." She attached her GPS location and hit send, then swore when she saw the message fail to deliver. No cell service. The trail ahead curved to the right, following the contours of what her map indicated was a steep ravine. Hannah could hear water running somewhere below, probably a creek cutting through the valley floor. The sound was reassuring after hours of unnatural silence. She'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes when she came around a bend and saw something that stopped her cold. A pair of hiking boots hung from a tree branch directly over the trail, dangling by their laces about 6 feet off the ground. They were good boots, expensive leather ones that looked like they'd seen serious use. Below them, carved into a tree trunk at eye level, was another symbol, not the star pattern she'd been seeing, but something that looked almost like a crude map. Hannah approached carefully, studying the carving. It showed what might have been a trail system, with various symbols marking different locations. One symbol, repeated several times, looked disturbingly like a stick figure. As she stood there trying to interpret the markings, she became aware that the forest around her was no longer empty. She couldn't see anyone, couldn't point to any specific sign of human presence, but every instinct she'd developed in years of dangerous social work situations was screaming that she was surrounded. The feeling was so strong that she actually turned in a full circle, scanning the trees, looking for some concrete sign of what her subconscious had detected. Nothing, but the sensation persisted, and with it came a growing certainty that she needed to get off this trail immediately. Hannah backed away from the hanging boots, not taking her eyes off the forest around her. She'd gone maybe 20 steps when she heard something that nearly made her scream, the sound of someone dropping down from a tree, landing on the trail behind her with a soft thud. She spun around and saw a figure standing next to the boots. Human, definitely, but something was wrong with the proportions. Too thin, too tall, with arms that seemed to hang longer than they should. The figure was dressed in what looked like a mixture of outdoor gear and handmade clothing, all of it stained and weathered. For a moment, neither of them moved. Hannah could make out a face beneath a tangle of matted hair, pale skin, dark eyes that seemed too large for the skull, features that might once have been normal but now looked somehow stretched, distorted. The figure raised one hand in what might have been a greeting, or might have been a warning. Then it opened its mouth and produced a sound that would echo in Hannah's nightmares for years to come. Not quite a whistle, not quite a human voice, but something in between that seemed to carry meaning she couldn't understand. From the forest around them came answers, dozens of them, maybe more, the same eerie, not quite whistle rising from the trees on both sides of the trail. Hannah realized with growing horror that she'd walked into the middle of something, that the watchers she'd sensed had been communicating about her, coordinating their movements, and now they were closing in. She did the only thing she could think of. She ran. Hannah crashed through the underbrush with no plan beyond getting away from the trail and the things that had been surrounding her. Branches tore at her jacket and pack, roots caught her feet, and more than once she nearly tumbled headfirst down steep slopes, but she kept running. Behind her, the forest erupted in sound. The whistle calls were everywhere now, rising from the trees like some nightmare version of birdsong. They seemed to be coordinating, directing each other, and Hannah realized with sick certainty that whatever these things were, they were hurting her. She burst through a stand of mountain laurel and found herself at the edge of a ravine that dropped away into darkness. Water roared somewhere far below, and the only way across was a fallen tree that looked like it had been there for decades. Hannah didn't hesitate. She started across, using her trekking poles for balance, trying not to look down at the drop that would certainly kill her if she fell. Halfway across, she made the mistake of looking back. They were at the edge of the ravine, watching her. At least a dozen figures, maybe more, standing in the shadows at the forest edge. In the dappled light filtering through the canopy, she could see that they were human, or had been once. But something was wrong with all of them. The same distortion she'd noticed in the first one. Too thin, too tall, moving in ways that seemed to bend at impossible angles. One of them, a woman, Hannah thought, though it was hard to be sure, stepped forward and raised her hand. For a moment, Hannah thought she was going to speak, maybe try to communicate normally. Instead, the woman opened her mouth and produced that same not-quite whistle, a sound that seemed to bypass Hannah's ears and resonate directly in her bones. Hannah lost her balance. She managed to throw herself forward as she fell, landing hard on the far side of the ravine with her legs dangling over the edge. Pain shot through her ribs where she'd hit the rocky ground, but she scrambled up and kept running without looking back. The forest on this side of the ravine was different, older, with massive trees that blocked out most of the sky. The underbrush was sparse, allowing Hannah to move more easily, but it also meant there was nowhere to hide. She could hear them behind her, crossing the ravine with an ease that suggested they'd done it many times before. Hannah tried to think tactically. In her work, she'd dealt with dangerous situations before. Domestic violence calls, gang territories, drug houses. The key was always to understand what the other person wanted, to find some way to communicate or negotiate. But these things didn't seem interested in communication. They were hunting her, and she had no idea why. She crested a small hill and saw something ahead that made her heart sink. Another trail. Not the one she'd been on before, but a parallel path that looked equally old and overgrown. She'd been running in a circle, and now she was back in their territory. But as she got closer, Hannah noticed something that gave her hope. This trail showed recent maintenance. Someone had been clearing fallen branches, cutting back encroaching vegetation. More importantly, there were fresh footprints in the mud beside a small stream crossing. Boot prints that looked normal, human-sized, recent. She knelt and examined the prints more carefully. Two different people, she thought, wearing different brands of hiking boots. Both sets of tracks were heading in the same direction, deeper into the forest. Other hikers, people who might be able to help, or at least provide safety in numbers. Hannah made another decision that would prove to be a mistake. Instead of trying to find her way back to her car, she followed the tracks. The trail wound through increasingly dense forest, climbing steadily toward what her map suggested was a series of high ridges. The trees here were enormous, ancient oaks and chestnuts that had somehow survived the blight, their trunks so massive that several people holding hands couldn't have encircled them. It was among these giants that Hannah found the first camp. The site had been used recently, within the last few days, she estimated. A fire ring with cold ashes, flattened areas where tents had been pitched, even some trash that hadn't been properly packed out. But something was wrong with the scene. The camps looked abandoned in haste, as if the occupants had left suddenly without taking time to pack properly. Hannah found a sleeping bag stuffed carelessly under a fallen log, its expensive down filling spilling out through tears in the fabric. Nearby, she discovered a camp stove that had been dropped and not retrieved, its fuel canister dented as if someone had stepped on it while running. Most disturbing of all was what she found hanging from a tree branch about 10 feet off the ground, a digital camera, suspended by its neck strap, swaying gently in the breeze. Hannah managed to retrieve it using a long branch, just as she had with the child's backpack. The camera was a nice one, professional quality, and it still had power. She scrolled through the photos on the LCD screen, and what she saw made her stomach turn. The first dozen images were normal hiking photos, scenic vistas, wildflowers, the kind of pictures any outdoor enthusiast might take. But then the content began to change. Photos of carved trees, similar to what Hannah had been seeing but more elaborate, more complex. Images of symbols scratched into rocks, of strange structures built from branches and stones. And then came the photos that made Hannah's hands shake. Pictures taken at night, using the camera's flash. Blurry, hard to interpret at first, but clearly showing figures moving through the forest. The photographer had been trying to document something, to capture evidence of what they were seeing. In the final image, taken from inside what looked like a tent, the camera had captured something that defied immediate understanding. A face pressed against the tent fabric from outside, distorted by the material but clearly visible. The features were human but wrong. Eyes too large, mouth opened in what might have been a scream or a laugh, teeth that seemed too sharp and too numerous. Hannah turned off the camera and clipped it to her pack. Whatever had happened to these campers, she was starting to understand that it was part of a pattern. People came up here, people went missing, and their belongings ended up displayed like trophies or warnings. She was about to continue following the trail when she heard something that made her freeze. Voices, normal human voices having what sounded like a casual conversation. Told you we should have brought more water. Getting too old for this kind of hiking. Check the map again. I think we missed a turn. The voices were coming from ahead, maybe a quarter mile up the trail. Hannah felt a surge of relief so strong it nearly brought tears to her eyes. Other people, normal people, who could help her get out of this nightmare. She called out, "Hello, can you hear me? I need help." The voices stopped immediately. Hannah waited, listening, but heard nothing more. She started up the trail toward where the voices had been coming from, calling out periodically, but got no response. After about 10 minutes of hiking, she came to a clearing where the trail split into 3 directions. There was no sign that anyone had been there recently. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, nothing to suggest human passage. But Hannah was certain she'd heard voices coming from this direction. She stood in the center of the clearing studying the 3 trail options when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Each of the 3 trails was marked with a different symbol carved into a tree at the junction. The same symbols she'd been seeing throughout her hike, but now they seemed to form some kind of system, a coded message she couldn't read. As she stood there trying to decide which path to take, Hannah became aware that the forest around her was no longer empty. The watchers had found her again, and this time they weren't bothering to hide. She could see them now, standing just inside the tree line around the clearing. 2 dozen at least, maybe more, all of them wrong in the same way, human but distorted, like people reflected in funhouse mirrors. They stood perfectly still, watching her, and Hannah realized they'd been herding her toward this place all along. The voices she'd heard hadn't been from other hikers. They'd been bait, lures designed to draw her deeper into whatever territory these things controlled. One of them stepped forward, the same tall, thin figure she'd encountered at the Hanging Boots. Up close, in the dappled sunlight of the clearing, Hannah could see details that made her skin crawl. The figure's clothes were a patchwork of different fabrics and materials, stitched together with what looked like sinew or plant fibers. Its hair was long and matted, woven with small bones and bits of metal that caught the light. Most disturbing of all were its eyes. They were undeniably human, intelligent and aware, but they held an expression Hannah had never seen before. Not malice exactly, but a kind of patient hunger that suggested this thing could wait a very long time to get what it wanted. The figure raised one hand and pointed toward the leftmost trail. Then it opened its mouth and produced a series of sounds that weren't quite words but clearly carried meaning. From around the clearing came responses, more of the same almost language, a conversation Hannah couldn't understand, but that was obviously about her. She realized they were giving her a chance to choose her own path, to walk willingly in the direction they wanted her to go. The alternative, she suspected, would involve considerably more unpleasantness. Hannah shouldered her pack and started toward the left trail. As she passed the tall figure, it fell into step beside her, close enough that she could smell its scent, earth and decay, and something else, something organic that reminded her of meat left too long in the sun. Behind them, the others formed a loose procession, following at a distance that suggested they were escorts rather than captors. But Hannah had no illusions about her situation. She was being taken somewhere for some purpose, and resistance would only make things worse. The trail they followed was different from the others she'd been on, more maintained, with recent improvements that suggested regular use. Someone had built log bridges over stream crossings, had carved steps into steep sections, had even installed handrails in a few places. After about an hour of walking, they crested a ridge and Hannah saw their destination spread out in the valley below, a settlement that looked like something from another century or another world entirely. The community in the valley defied easy description. At first glance, it looked like a historical preservation site. Log cabins and simple frame buildings arranged around a central clearing, with gardens and what might have been workshops scattered throughout. But the longer Hannah looked, the more details emerged that suggested this place was neither historical nor abandoned. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and she could see people moving between the buildings. Gardens showed recent cultivation, and laundry hung from lines strung between trees. This was a living community, hidden deep in the mountains, completely cut off from the outside world. Her escort, she'd started thinking of the tall figure as guide in her mind, gestured for her to stop at the ridge crest. It produced a sound that was almost but not quite a whistle, a complex series of notes that carried clearly down into the valley. From below came an answering call, and Hannah watched as people emerged from buildings and gathered in the central clearing. Even at this distance, she could see that they shared the same wrong proportions as her captors, too tall, too thin, moving in ways that seemed to bend at impossible angles. Guide gestured for her to continue down a switchback path that had been carved into the hillside. As they descended, Hannah tried to count the buildings and estimate the population. At least 30 structures of various sizes, from small cabins that might house a single person to larger buildings that could accommodate families or serve as community spaces. Maybe 60 or 70 people total, possibly more. The path leveled out at the valley floor, and Hannah found herself walking through what was clearly the outskirts of the settlement. Here were the practical buildings, workshops, storage sheds, what looked like a tannery based on the smell. She passed drying racks hung with meat and hides, tool sheds filled with implements that ranged from modern camping gear to handmade implements that looked medieval. It was the tools that first made Hannah understand the true nature of this place. Mixed in with hiking boots and camp stoves were items that could only have been taken from other people, personal belongings that told stories of lives interrupted. A child's toy compass, a woman's jewelry, a man's college ring, hundreds of small items carefully maintained and organized, representing dozens of people who had walked into these mountains and never walked out. Guide led her toward the center of the settlement, where a crowd had gathered to watch their arrival. Hannah tried to maintain professional composure, to observe and analyze as she'd been trained to do in difficult situations. But what she saw challenged every assumption she'd made about human nature and civilization. These people, and they were people, she was certain of that now, represented multiple generations, children who looked almost normal except for their too bright eyes and too sharp teeth, adults in their prime who moved with predatory grace, elderly individuals whose elongated limbs and stretched features suggested decades of whatever change had affected this community. But it was their behavior that truly disturbed her. They watched her with the focused attention of predators, but there was intelligence there too. They were curious about her, studying her responses, evaluating her reactions. This wasn't a mindless mob. It was a community with its own rules and social structures. Guide stopped in front of the largest building, a 2-story log structure that was clearly the community's center. From inside came the sound of voices and what might have been music, though played on instruments Hannah didn't recognize. An elderly woman emerged from the building, and Hannah immediately understood that this was someone important. Unlike the others, she moved with normal human proportions, though her age was impossible to determine. She could have been 60 or 90, with silver hair and eyes that held decades of accumulated knowledge. The woman approached Hannah and spoke in clear, unaccented English. "Welcome to our home. I am Mother Sarah. We've been expecting you." The casual normalcy of the greeting was somehow more terrifying than all the whistling and stalking had been. Hannah found her voice and managed to respond. "Expecting me?" "Oh yes, we've been watching you since you entered our territory. You're different from most of the people who find their way here." Mother Sarah smiled, and Hannah noticed that her teeth, while human, were filed to points. "Most of them are just tourists, people looking for a brief adventure before returning to their comfortable lives. But you're running from something, aren't you?" Hannah felt her social worker training kick in despite the surreal circumstances. This woman was clearly the leader of this community, and engaging with her civilly might be the key to survival. "I'm just hiking, taking some time off work to clear my head." "What kind of work?" Mother Sarah's eyes were sharp, calculating. "Social work, child protection services." Something shifted in the woman's expression, a flicker of interest, maybe recognition. "Ah, someone who understands that the world is full of predators, someone who knows what people are really capable of when they think no one is watching." The crowd around them had grown larger, and Hannah could feel their attention like a physical weight. Some of the children had crept closer, studying her with the same predatory focus as the adults. Their faces were almost normal, but Hannah caught glimpses of behaviors that made her skin crawl. The way they tilted their heads at unnatural angles, the way their eyes tracked movement with perfect coordination, the way they breathed in unison as if responding to some shared signal. "You must be tired from your journey," Mother Sarah continued, "and hungry. We don't get many visitors who make it this far into our territory. Most turn back when they hear the warnings." "What warnings?" Hannah asked, though she suspected she already knew. "The old man at the gas station. He's been our collaborator for many years. Keeps people away from trails they shouldn't take, sends the curious ones to safer paths, but sometimes people don't listen." Mother Sarah's smile widened. "Sometimes people like you decide they know better than local wisdom." Hannah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Earl works for you?" "Works with us, let's say. His family has been helping us maintain our privacy for 3 generations. In exchange, we leave the valley settlements alone, a mutually beneficial arrangement." The implications hit Hannah like a physical blow. This wasn't a chance encounter or a case of getting lost on an unmarked trail. She'd been deliberately directed here, funneled toward this place by people who knew exactly what would happen to her. "Why?" she managed to ask. Mother Sarah studied her for a long moment, then gestured toward the community building. "Come, let me show you something that will help you understand." Hannah looked around at the circle of faces watching her. She could run. The crowd hadn't closed in completely, and there were gaps between the buildings that might offer escape routes. But where would she go? She was deep in unfamiliar territory, surrounded by people who knew these mountains better than she ever could. And part of her, the professional part that had spent years trying to understand the worst aspects of human behavior, needed to know what this place really was. She followed Mother Sarah into the building. The interior was a mixture of primitive and modern that reflected the community's hybrid nature. Hand-hewn beams supported a roof fitted with solar panels visible through gaps in the ceiling. Oil lamps provided most of the lighting, but Hannah spotted electrical outlets and what looked like a modern radio communication setup in one corner. The walls were covered with maps, not just topographical charts of the local area, but hand-drawn diagrams that showed trail systems, patrol routes, and what appeared to be seasonal migration patterns. Scattered among the maps were photographs, hundreds of them, showing people in hiking gear. Most were clearly surveillance photos taken from a distance, but some looked like they'd been posed, formal portraits of people who didn't look happy to be photographed. "We've been living in these mountains for over 40 years, Mother Sarah said, noticing Hannah's attention to the photos. Started as a religious community, people seeking to escape the corruption and violence of the modern world. We built this place with our own hands, learned to live off the land, created something pure and sustainable." Hannah studied the photographs more closely. The faces showed a progression over time, recent digital prints mixed with older Polaroids and even some that looked like they'd been taken with film cameras from the 1980s. Hundreds of people, all of them wearing modern hiking gear, all of them looking terrified. "What happened to them?" Hannah asked, though part of her already knew. They became part of our community, some willingly, some less so. You see, we discovered early on that complete isolation wasn't sustainable. We needed new blood, new skills, new perspectives, and the mountains provided them to us, one hiker at a time. Mother Sarah moved to a large map that dominated one wall, showing the entire region with trails marked in different colors. Hannah realized she was looking at a hunting ground, with patrol routes and ambush points marked with the same symbol she'd been seeing carved into trees. The early years were difficult, Mother Sarah continued. We lost people to accidents, to disease, to simple despair. By 1978, our population had dropped to fewer than 20 adults. We were dying out, and we knew that returning to the outside world wasn't an option. Too many bridges burned, too many laws broken in our quest for purity. Hannah forced herself to ask the question, what laws? Mother Sarah's smile was cold. We were never just a religious community, Ms. Carlyle. We were people who understood that civilization is a lie, that humans are predators by nature, and that the only honest way to live is to embrace that truth. We came here to create a society based on the natural order, the strong taking what they needed from the weak. The casual admission of what amounted to organized predation made Hannah's social worker instinct scream. She'd encountered similar philosophies before, usually from individuals who used pseudo-intellectual justifications for abuse and violence, but she'd never seen it implemented on a community scale, turned into a sustainable way of life. So you started hunting hikers. We started recruiting, Mother Sarah corrected, people who were already lost, already running from something, already separated from the herd. People like you, Miss Carlyle. People who had seen enough of human nature to understand that civilization is just a thin veneer over animal instincts. Hannah realized the woman was trying to convert her, to make her see the community's actions as logical and justified. It was a technique she'd encountered before, abusers trying to make their victims complicit in their own victimization. Some people adapted quickly, Mother Sarah continued. Others took longer to understand their new circumstances. A few never adjusted at all. She gestured toward a corner where Hannah noticed what looked like restraints built into the wall, iron rings set into the logs, chains, other implements that suggested this building had been used for purposes she didn't want to contemplate. The children adapt fastest, Mother Sarah said. Young minds are more flexible, more willing to accept new paradigms. Adults often cling to outdated concepts of morality and law, but given time and proper guidance, most people can learn to see the world as it really is. Hannah looked at the photographs again and noticed something that made her stomach turn. Some of the faces were repeated, the same people in multiple photos, but changed. In the early pictures they looked terrified, desperate. In later ones their expressions had shifted to something approaching acceptance, even contentment. A few showed what looked almost like pride. You brainwash them, we educate them, we show them that the life they were living, following arbitrary rules created by weak people to control strong ones, was a form of slavery. Here, people are free to be what they really are. Mother Sarah moved to another section of the wall, where Hannah saw a different kind of documentation. Handwritten journals, technical manuals, what looked like medical texts. We've learned a great deal over the years about human psychology, about behavior modification, about the techniques that can help people transition from one worldview to another. The physical changes, Hannah said, thinking of the elongated limbs and distorted features she'd observed. That's not natural. Mother Sarah's expression grew more serious. No, that's something else entirely, something we didn't expect when we first settled here. She moved to a locked cabinet and removed a thick folder. The mountains have their own agenda, their own way of marking people who stay too long. She opened the folder and showed Hannah a series of medical photographs documenting the physical changes that occurred in long-term residents. The progression was gradual, but undeniable, normal human proportions slowly stretching and distorting over a period of years. We think it's something in the water, or maybe spores from the older trees. Could be radiation from some mineral deposit we haven't identified. Whatever it is, it affects everyone who lives here permanently. The changes aren't painful, and they don't seem to impact health or lifespan. If anything, people become stronger, more agile, better adapted to life in the forest. Hannah stared at the photographs, understanding now why the community members moved the way they did, why their voices had that strange, not quite human quality. They were still people, but they were becoming something else, something adapted to life in this isolated valley. The children born here show the changes from birth, Mother Sarah continued. They're the first generation of true mountain people, perfectly adapted to our environment and our way of life. A sound from outside interrupted their conversation, a long, complex whistle that rose and fell in patterns Hannah was beginning to recognize as some form of communication. Mother Sarah listened intently, then nodded to herself. Our scouts have returned from patrol. It seems you weren't traveling alone after all. Hannah's heart jumped. What do you mean? Someone has been following your trail since yesterday afternoon. A man, traveling light and moving carefully, professional tracking skills, military training possibly. He's been very cautious, staying well back, but our people are better at forest craft than most. Mother Sarah smiled. We'll have him within the hour. Hannah tried to think who might be following her. She told no one about her specific plans, had deliberately chosen this remote area to avoid human contact, unless... The GPS coordinates, she said, remembering the text message she'd tried to send to her sister. If someone was monitoring communications in the area. Mother Sarah nodded approvingly. Very good. Yes, we maintain surveillance of all electronic communications in our territory. Your message never reached its intended recipient, but it did alert us to your presence. And apparently, it alerted someone else as well. The implications were staggering. This community had been operating for decades, with technical capabilities that suggested resources and expertise far beyond what she'd assumed. They weren't just mountain primitives living off the land. They were an organized group with sophisticated methods for controlling their territory and the people who entered it. Who's following me? Hannah asked. We'll find out soon enough, but first, you need to make a decision. Mother Sarah closed the folder and returned it to the cabinet. You can become part of our community willingly, learn our ways, contribute your skills to our survival. Social work experience would be very valuable here. We're always dealing with integration challenges when new people arrive. Hannah felt sick at the implication. They wanted her to help them break down other victims, to use her professional training to make the conversion process more efficient. Or, she asked, or we'll help you make the decision. The process takes longer that way, and it's less pleasant for everyone involved, but the end result is the same. Everyone who stays in the valley long enough eventually finds their place in our community. Before Hannah could respond, the door opened and Guide entered, accompanied by 2 other community members. One of them was carrying something that made Hannah's blood freeze, a tactical backpack and what looked like military-grade equipment. Bring him in, Mother Sarah called. They dragged in a man Hannah had never seen before, 30s, athletic build, wearing dark clothing and tactical gear. His hands were zip-tied behind his back, and there was blood on his face from what looked like a recent struggle. But his eyes were alert and focused, scanning the room with professional assessment. Federal agent, Mother Sarah said matter-of-factly. FBI, based on his identification and equipment. Apparently your disappearance triggered some kind of investigation. Hannah stared at the man, trying to understand. She hadn't been missing long enough to warrant federal attention, and she deliberately avoided telling anyone where she was going. How had the FBI gotten involved so quickly? The agent looked at her and spoke in a calm, professional voice. Miss Carlyle, I'm Special Agent David Chen. Are you injured? She's fine, Mother Sarah interrupted, though I'm curious about how the federal government became involved in what should be a simple missing person case. Agent Chen ignored her and continued speaking to Hannah. Your sister contacted the FBI when she received an emergency alert from your phone's GPS system. We've been tracking the signal, but it stopped transmitting about 6 hours ago. Hannah felt a flicker of hope. She had no memory of sending an emergency alert, but modern smartphones had automatic features that activated in crisis situations. If the FBI was here, if they were tracking her phone, maybe there was a chance of rescue. Mother Sarah seemed to read her thoughts. I'm afraid your phone's GPS was disabled some time ago. We've learned to be very thorough about eliminating tracking devices. As for Agent Chen here, he followed a cold trail to reach us, and his superiors have no idea where he is. The agent's expression didn't change, but Hannah caught a flicker of something. Concern, maybe, or calculation. Actually, ma'am, that's not entirely accurate. I'm part of a coordinated search effort. Multiple teams, regular check-ins, full satellite coverage of the search area. Interesting, Mother Sarah said. Then you won't mind if we test that claim. She nodded to Guide, who produced a handheld radio from Agent Chen's equipment. Mother Sarah turned it on and began scanning through frequencies, picking up only static and occasional fragments of distant conversations. Nothing that sounded like an active search operation. It appears your backup isn't as reliable as you suggested, she said to the agent, which means you're both going to be our guests for a while until we can determine the best way to handle this situation. Hannah realized the moment for any chance of easy escape had passed. They were now both prisoners of a community that had been operating outside the law for decades, led by people who had perfected techniques for breaking down their victims' resistance and converting them into willing participants in their own captivity. But as she looked at Agent Chen, she saw something in his eyes that gave her hope. He wasn't broken, wasn't giving up. He was observing, planning, looking for opportunities. And for the first time since she'd heard that first whistle in the darkness, Hannah began to think that survival might be possible. The question was whether they could figure out how to escape before the mountains themselves began to change them into something else entirely. Mother Sarah assigned them to a small cabin at the edge of the settlement, with Guide and 2 others taking shifts as guards outside. The building was obviously designed for holding reluctant guests. The windows were barred, the door locked from the outside, and the interior had been stripped of anything that could be used as a weapon or tool for escape. Agent Chen proved to be more talkative once they were alone. His real name was David. He'd been with the FBI for 8 years, and Hannah's case had landed on his desk through a series of coincidences that suggested federal attention wasn't entirely unwelcome. Your sister didn't just call local police when you went missing, he explained, examining the bars on the windows. She called your supervisor at Child Protective Services, who mentioned that you'd been working on some unusual cases before your leave started. Cases involving missing children in rural areas, families that seemed to disappear without trace. Hannah felt a chill of recognition. The Appalachian cases. 17 families over the past 5 years, all of them from urban areas, all of them with histories of domestic violence or child abuse allegations. They'd pack up and move to remote mountain communities, then seem to vanish completely. No forwarding addresses, no contact with relatives, no paper trail of any kind. Hannah had worked on 3 of those cases, had been frustrated by the complete lack of leads or cooperation from local authorities. Children she'd been trying to protect had simply disappeared along with their families, and her attempts to follow up had hit stone walls of bureaucratic indifference and jurisdictional confusion. You think they ended up here? David nodded grimly. This place, or others like it. We've identified at least 4 similar communities in the Appalachians, probably more in other mountain regions. They recruit from people who are already marginalized, already isolated from mainstream society, perfect victims because no one looks too hard when they disappear. The pieces were falling into place for Hannah. The community's sophisticated surveillance capabilities, their knowledge of law enforcement procedures, their ability to operate undetected for decades. It all suggested an organization much larger and more coordinated than a single isolated settlement. How long have you been tracking them? About 2 years, since we started seeing patterns in the missing persons data, but they're careful professional. Every time we get close to finding one of their locations, the trail goes cold. This is the first time we've actually made contact with an active site. Hannah looked around their prison and felt despair creeping in. A lot of good it's doing us. Actually, it's better than you think. David moved to the far corner of the room and began examining the log construction. They made a mistake bringing us here together. I've been mapping the settlement layout, counting the population, observing their security procedures, and I've got equipment they don't know about. He rolled up his left sleeve and showed Hannah what looked like a standard fitness tracker watch. GPS beacon, encrypted communication emergency transmitter. Military grade, disguised as consumer electronics. It's been broadcasting our location continuously since I arrived. Hope flared in Hannah's chest. So help is coming? Eventually. But we can't wait for rescue. These people are too smart to let us sit here indefinitely. They'll move us or eliminate us long before any rescue team can organize and reach this location. As if summoned by their conversation, the door opened and Mother Sarah entered, flanked by Guide and another community member Hannah hadn't seen before. a woman who moved with the same predatory grace as the others but wore what looked like a nurse's uniform. "I hope you're settling in comfortably," Mother Sarah said. "I wanted to discuss your futures here and what your integration process will look like." The nurse moved toward Hannah with a medical bag, but David stepped between them. "Stay back." Mother Sarah smiled. "Agent Jen, violence won't help your situation. Dr. Martinez is simply going to perform a basic health assessment. We need to know if either of you have any medical conditions that might affect your adaptation to our environment." "What kind of adaptation?" Hannah asked. "The physical changes I mentioned earlier begin within the first few weeks of extended exposure to our valley. The process goes more smoothly if we can monitor it medically and provide appropriate supplements." Mother Sarah gestured for Dr. Martinez to proceed. "It's not optional." David grabbed Hannah's arm and pulled her toward the far corner of the room. "Don't let them touch you. Whatever they're planning to inject or expose you to, it's the beginning of the conversion process." Mother Sarah sighed. "This is exactly why the voluntary approach is preferable. Fighting the inevitable just makes everything more difficult." She nodded to Guide, who produced a device Hannah recognized from her social work training, a taser. "Last chance to cooperate willingly," Mother Sarah said. David reached into his boot and came up with a knife Hannah hadn't known he was carrying. "Back off, all of you." The standoff lasted maybe 10 seconds before Guide fired the taser. David convulsed and dropped, the knife spinning away across the floor. Before Hannah could react, Dr. Martinez had grabbed her arm and plunged a syringe into her bicep. The injection burned like fire racing through her bloodstream. Hannah tried to pull away, but her coordination was already failing. The room spun, colors became too bright, and sounds took on a hollow, echoing quality. "Sedative plus the first stage of the adaptation compound," Mother Sarah explained as Hannah slumped to the floor. "She'll sleep for about 12 hours, then wake up with enhanced senses and improved physical coordination. The psychological effects take longer to manifest." Through the fog descending over her mind, Hannah heard David struggling back to consciousness, heard him trying to speak through the after effects of the taser. But the sound seemed to be coming from very far away, and darkness was closing in from all sides. When she woke, everything had changed. The first thing Hannah noticed was that she could hear individual conversations from buildings scattered throughout the settlement. Not just the murmur of voices, but actual words spoken in normal tones hundreds of yards away. She could distinguish between different speakers, could track their movements by sound alone. The second thing she noticed was that she could see in the dark. The cabin had no artificial lighting, but she could make out every detail of the interior as clearly as if it were daylight. David was lying on the floor nearby, still unconscious, but she could see the steady rise and fall of his breathing. The third thing she noticed was hunger, not ordinary hunger, but a gnawing, desperate need that seemed to originate in her bones. Her mouth watered at the thought of meat, and she found herself thinking about the deer she'd seen during her hike with an intensity that felt almost sexual. "The enhancements are impressive, aren't they?" Mother Sarah's voice came from the doorway. Hannah turned and saw the woman standing there with Dr. Martinez and 2 guards. "Improved senses, increased strength and agility, enhanced night vision. You're experiencing the first stage of becoming what humans were meant to be before civilization made us weak." Hannah tried to speak but found her voice had changed. It came out as a lower pitch, with a resonance that seemed to vibrate in her chest. "What did you do to me?" "Gave you a gift. The compound we've developed accelerates the natural adaptation process that occurs in people who live in our valley. Instead of taking months or years, the changes happen over a few weeks." Dr. Martinez stepped forward with another syringe. "This is the second stage. It will complete the physical modifications and begin the neurological adjustments that will help you integrate with our community's social structure." The hunger in Hannah's stomach intensified at the sight of the needle, and she realized with growing horror that part of her wanted the injection. Her body was craving whatever compound they'd already given her, was demanding more of the substance that was reshaping her at a cellular level. "The addiction component ensures compliance during the transition period," Mother Sarah explained, reading Hannah's expression. "Fighting the process just makes the cravings worse. Acceptance brings relief and, eventually, transcendence." Hannah looked at David, who was beginning to stir. Whatever they'd given him, it was wearing off faster than her sedative had. When he woke up fully and saw what was happening to her, would he still see her as human? Would she still see herself that way? Agent Chen will receive his first treatment when he wakes up, Mother Sarah continued. We've found that law enforcement personnel often have the most difficulty accepting their new circumstances, but they also tend to become our most effective hunters once the conversion is complete. Something about their training and mindset adapts well to predatory behavior. The word hunters sent a chill through Hannah that penetrated even the fog of enhanced sensations and artificial cravings. She was beginning to understand what this community really was, not just isolated survivalists, but something much worse. They were creating a new kind of human, one designed for a lifestyle that treated other people as prey. Dr. Martinez approached with a second syringe, and Hannah found she didn't have the will to resist. The hunger was too strong, the promise of relief too appealing. She extended her arm and felt the needle slide in, felt the burning liquid enter her bloodstream and begin its work of rewriting her fundamental nature. But as the injection took effect, as her vision sharpened even further and her hearing expanded to pick up sounds from miles away, Hannah caught something the others had missed. Through all the enhanced sensory input, past the conversations and activities of the settlement, she heard something that made her newly predatory instincts go on full alert. Helicopters, still distant but approaching fast, and flying low in a pattern that suggested search and rescue operations. David's equipment had worked. Help was coming. The question was whether it would arrive before the conversion process made her into something that would see rescuers as threats rather than salvation. David came to just as the sound of helicopters became audible to normal human hearing. Mother Sarah's expression shifted from satisfied control to sharp concern as she recognized the distinctive rhythm of military aircraft. "How many people know about this location?" she demanded, grabbing David by his shirt. He managed a weak smile despite the lingering effects of the taser. "More than you can handle." The settlement erupted into activity. Through the barred windows, Hannah could see community members running between buildings, some carrying weapons, others loading supplies into vehicles she hadn't noticed before, ATVs and dirt bikes hidden under camouflage tarps. Mother Sarah spoke rapidly into a handheld radio, coordinating what was obviously a well-rehearsed evacuation plan. Code 7, all teams. Implement dispersal protocol Delta. Rendezvous at the secondary location in 48 hours. Hannah realized the enhanced hearing from their injections was both a curse and a blessing. She could overhear tactical communications from multiple groups, could track the movement of people throughout the settlement, but the sensory overload was almost overwhelming. Every sound seemed amplified to painful levels. "They've done this before," David observed, watching the organized chaos outside. "This isn't panic, it's a practiced withdrawal." Dr. Martinez prepared another syringe, moving with urgent efficiency. "We need to complete the second stage treatments before we move them. Half-converted subjects are unpredictable and dangerous." Mother Sarah shook her head. "No time. We'll finish the process at the backup site." She turned to Guide. "Prepare them for transport. Full restraints. They're both flight risks now." But as Guide approached with zip ties and what looked like a portable gurney, the sound of the approaching helicopters suddenly changed. The steady rhythm became erratic, then shifted to the distinctive whoop-whoop-whop of aircraft in distress. Through her enhanced hearing, Hannah could pick up radio transmissions from the aircraft. "Mayday, mayday. We're experiencing multiple system failures. Navigation is compromised. GPS showing impossible readings." Mother Sarah smiled grimly. "Electronic countermeasures. We've had 30 years to prepare for this kind of intrusion." The helicopter sounds faded as the aircraft moved away from the valley, their crews undoubtedly struggling with equipment failures that made navigation impossible. Hannah felt her hopes for rescue crashing along with the disoriented search teams. "How?" David asked. "The same thing that causes the physical changes in long-term residents," Mother Sarah explained. "Something in the geology of this valley interferes with electronic systems. Natural electromagnetic effects that we've learned to amplify and direct. Your tracking devices stopped working the moment you entered our territory." Hannah looked at David's fitness tracker and saw that its display was now completely dead. Whatever help might be coming, it wouldn't be able to find them through electronic means. But David was studying the evacuation activities with professional interest. "You're abandoning the settlement. That means you're not as secure here as you pretended. We're adapting to changing circumstances. This location has served us well for decades, but nothing lasts forever." Mother Sarah gestured to Guide, who began loading equipment onto a cart. "We have other sites, other communities. The movement is much larger than what you've seen here." The implications were staggering. This wasn't just one isolated group of predators. It was part of a network, possibly spanning multiple states with resources and capabilities that put them on par with organized crime syndicates or terrorist cells. As the evacuation continued around them, Hannah found herself fighting an internal battle between her enhanced predatory instincts and her remaining human consciousness. The injection was working faster than Mother Sarah had indicated, and she could feel her emotional responses changing, her moral framework shifting to accommodate new priorities. When she looked at David, her first thought was no longer about cooperation or rescue. Instead, she found herself evaluating him as potential prey, noting his physical fitness, his alertness, the way he moved. The realization that she was losing her humanity at a neurological level was terrifying, but even the terror felt distant, analytical. David seemed to notice the change in her expression. "Hannah, stay with me. Whatever they gave you, you can fight it." "Actually, she can't," Dr. Martinez interjected. "The neurological modifications are irreversible once they reach a certain threshold. She's already beginning to think like one of us." Hannah tested the accuracy of that statement and found it disturbingly true. Her priorities were shifting moment by moment, her definition of acceptable behavior expanding to include acts she would have found horrific just hours before. The hunger in her stomach had evolved into something more complex, not just a desire for food, but for the hunt itself, for the experience of taking down prey. But beneath the chemical changes, some core part of her consciousness remained intact, and that part was screaming warnings about what she was becoming. "How long before the conversion is complete?" David asked. "Hours, not days," Mother Sarah replied. "The enhanced formula we've developed works much faster than natural exposure. By tomorrow morning, she'll be one of us in every way that matters." Guide finished loading their equipment and approached with the restraints. "Transport is ready." Before he could secure them, the building shook with a massive explosion that shattered windows throughout the settlement. Through the ringing in her ears, Hannah heard the unmistakable sound of gunfire, not hunting rifles, but automatic weapons firing in controlled bursts. Mother Sarah grabbed her radio. "All teams report status." The response crackled with static and panic. Ground Team Alpha under attack from the ridgeline. Sniper fire from multiple positions. They're using military-grade equipment. David smiled grimly. "You were right about the electronic countermeasures, but you underestimated how many people would be looking for a missing federal agent." Another explosion, closer this time, sent debris raining down on the settlement. Through the smoke and chaos, Hannah could see muzzle flashes from the surrounding hills. Professional marksmen in prepared positions, laying down covering fire for what was obviously an assault team moving through the valley. Mother Sarah's composure finally cracked. "This is impossible. No one could have tracked us here without electronic guidance." "Old-fashioned detective work," David explained. "Paper trails, witness interviews, satellite photography. Your community has been operating for 40 years. That's a lot of opportunities to leave traces. And when a federal agent goes missing while investigating organized kidnapping, the full resources of multiple agencies get involved." The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly. Hannah could hear the distinctive sound of flashbang grenades detonating throughout the settlement, followed by the coordinated movement of what sounded like multiple assault teams. The community members who weren't evacuating were mounting a defense, but they were clearly outgunned and outmaneuvered. Guide abandoned his attempt to restrain them, and instead grabbed a rifle from a weapons cache Hannah hadn't noticed. "Orders?" he asked Mother Sarah. She looked at Hannah and David with cold calculation. "Kill them both. We can't risk them being recovered alive." But as Guide raised his weapon, the cabin door exploded inward. The assault team that poured through moved with military precision, body armor, night vision, automatic weapons, and the kind of coordinated tactics that left no room for resistance. "Federal agents, drop your weapons." Guide spun toward the new threat, and Hannah watched with her enhanced senses as time seemed to slow down. She could see the micro-expressions on the faces of the assault team members, could track the trajectory of bullets with perfect clarity, could predict the outcome of the engagement before it fully developed. What she saw was Guide raising his rifle toward the federal agents, Mother Sarah reaching for a sidearm, Dr. Martinez diving for cover behind overturned furniture. She saw muzzle flashes and heard the distinctive crack of high-velocity rounds, saw blood spray in patterns that her predatory instincts analyzed with disturbing interest. When the shooting stopped, Guide and Mother Sarah were down, and Dr. Martinez was wounded, but alive. The assault team leader approached David and Hannah with professional caution. "Agent Chen, are you injured?" David struggled to sit up. "Mostly intact, but they've injected us with some kind of compound. Hannah needs immediate medical attention." The team leader, Hannah could see Morrison on his name tape, examined her with the clinical assessment of someone who'd seen chemical and biological weapons effects before. Pupils dilated, enhanced muscle tension, possible neurological involvement. "We'll get you to a level 1 trauma center as soon as the LZ is secure." But as they prepared to move her, Hannah realized she faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. The federal agents saw her as a victim who needed rescue and medical treatment. They had no idea that the treatment might be irreversible, that she was becoming something that would see them as prey rather than protectors. She could tell them about the changes, warn them about what she was becoming, and spend the rest of her life as a test subject in government laboratories. Or she could hide the extent of the conversion, pretend the effects were wearing off, and hope she could maintain enough human consciousness to control her new instincts. As they carried her toward the evacuation point, Hannah caught a scent that made her predatory hunger flare to life. The smell of the assault team members, their sweat and adrenaline creating an olfactory signature that marked them as potential prey. For just a moment, she found herself calculating distances and attack angles, imagining what it would feel like to hunt these men through the forest. Then the human part of her consciousness reasserted itself, horrified by the direction of her thoughts. She was losing the battle for her own mind, and the people trying to save her had no idea they might be rescuing something that would eventually hunt them down. The helicopter that evacuated them from the valley was a military aircraft with sophisticated navigation systems that worked normally once they cleared the electromagnetic interference field. As they flew toward the trauma center, Hannah watched the settlement burning below and wondered if she was the only survivor who carried the real infection, not in her bloodstream, but in the fundamental rewiring of her brain. The question was whether she could find a way to reverse the process before she became something that belonged back in that valley, hunting the people who had tried to save her. The Level 1 Trauma Center in Asheville was everything Hannah had expected from a government facility handling unusual cases, sterile, secure and staffed with medical personnel who asked few questions about how their patients had acquired such exotic symptoms. Dr. Rebecca Walsh, the lead physician on Hannah's case, was clearly familiar with chemical and biological weapons effects. She ran test after test, drew blood samples that disappeared into secure containers, and monitored Hannah's vital signs with equipment that looked more military than medical. The good news is that whatever compound you were exposed to doesn't appear to be immediately life-threatening, Dr. Walsh explained on Hannah's third day in the facility. Your enhanced sensory capabilities are stabilizing, and we're not seeing the continued physical deterioration that might indicate ongoing cellular damage. Hannah tried to look relieved, but the truth was more complicated. The physical changes weren't deteriorating because they were working exactly as designed. Her hearing remained so acute she could eavesdrop on conversations 3 rooms away. Her night vision was better than most nocturnal animals, and her muscle coordination had improved to the point where she could move with predatory silence that unnerved the nursing staff. "What about the psychological effects?" Hannah asked. Dr. Walsh consulted her tablet. "We've scheduled you for extensive evaluation with our psychiatric team. Some of the compounds we've encountered in similar cases can cause significant changes in personality and behavior patterns." Hannah nodded as if this was welcome news, but internally she was calculating how to fool the psychiatric evaluation. The hunger for human prey had stabilized into a constant background presence, manageable but never absent. Her moral framework had shifted to accommodate hunting behavior as natural and justified. Most disturbing of all, she was becoming very good at hiding these changes from the medical staff. "Has Agent Chen been experiencing similar symptoms?" Hannah asked. Dr. Walsh's expression became more guarded. "Agent Chen's case is different," He received a smaller dose of the compound, and his symptoms are resolving more quickly. He's actually being discharged today. Hannah felt a flicker of something that might have been relief or might have been predatory anticipation. David had been her anchor to human thinking during the worst of the conversion process. Without his presence, she wasn't sure how long she could maintain the pretense of recovery. That afternoon, David stopped by her room before leaving. He looked better, more like the professional federal agent she'd first met, less like the desperate prisoner from the mountain community. But Hannah's enhanced senses picked up details that suggested his recovery wasn't as complete as he wanted the doctors to believe. "How are you feeling?" he asked, taking the chair beside her bed. "Better. Still some lingering effects, but nothing I can't handle." Hannah watched his facial expressions with predatory focus, noting micro-expressions that indicated stress and deception. "What about you?" David was quiet for a moment, and Hannah realized he was studying her just as intently as she was studying him. The physical changes are mostly gone, but other things are harder to shake. "What kind of things?" "Dreams, mostly. Hunting dreams. And when I see people now, especially in crowded places, I find myself thinking about them differently." David met her eyes. "The doctors say it's normal trauma response, that the psychological effects will fade with time and therapy." Hannah recognized the careful phrasing. David was testing her, trying to determine if she was experiencing similar symptoms without revealing too much about his own condition. It was exactly what she would have done in his position. "Do you believe them?" she asked. "Do you?" They looked at each other across the small hospital room, two people who had survived something that changed them at a fundamental level, each trying to determine if the other was still human enough to trust. "I think," Hannah said carefully, "that some experiences leave permanent marks. The question is whether we can live with those marks without becoming something we wouldn't recognize." David nodded slowly. "The FBI wants me to continue investigating the mountain communities. They think my experience gives me unique insight into how these groups operate. And you want to do it." "Part of me wants to do it. The part that understands their methodology now, that can think like they think." David's voice dropped to just above a whisper. "The part that knows I could hunt them more effectively than any normal investigator ever could." Hannah felt a chill of recognition. David was fighting the same battle she was, trying to use the predatory instincts the community had given him for legitimate purposes, trying to channel the hunting behavior into socially acceptable forms. "What if that's exactly what they wanted?" she asked. "What if the whole point of the conversion process is to create hunters who can operate within normal society?" The implications hung between them like a physical presence. If the mountain communities were systematically converting law enforcement personnel and social workers, people with access to vulnerable populations and investigative authority, then the network Mother Sarah had described might be far more extensive and embedded than anyone realized. "I'm supposed to report any unusual symptoms or behavioral changes," David said. "Standard protocol for exposure to unknown substances. Are you going to?" David was quiet for a long moment. "Are you?" Hannah realized they were at a crossroads. They could trust each other with the truth about what they were becoming, or they could maintain the pretense and face the changes alone. The choice would determine not just their individual futures, but possibly the fate of other people who might encounter whatever they were turning into. "The hunger doesn't go away," she said finally. "The physical changes are stabilizing, but the psychological ones. I think about hunting. I dream about it. And sometimes, when I look at the medical staff, I find myself evaluating them as prey." David's expression didn't change, but she saw his shoulders relax slightly. "How long do you think we can hide it?" "I don't know, but I think we have to try. Because if the government figures out what we're becoming, we'll spend the rest of our lives in isolation cells while they try to reverse engineer the conversion process. And if we can't control it?" Hannah had been asking herself the same question. The predatory instincts were getting stronger, not weaker. The hunger was manageable now, but would it always be? How long before she stopped seeing other people as individuals and started seeing them only as potential prey? "Then we'll have to make a choice about what kind of monsters we want to be," she said. 3 days later, Hannah was discharged with a clean bill of health and a referral for ongoing psychiatric evaluation. The medical team had found no trace of the conversion compound in her bloodstream. Apparently, it was metabolized completely once the physical changes were established. From their perspective, she was a trauma victim who needed therapy, not a security threat. Hannah returned to her apartment in Asheville and tried to resume her normal life. But normal had ceased to exist. She couldn't sleep without dreaming of the hunt. She couldn't go to crowded places without her predatory instincts analyzing every person as potential prey. And most disturbing of all, she found herself missing the community in the mountains, not the violence or the captivity, but the sense of belonging to something that understood what she was becoming. 2 weeks after her discharge, David called. "I found something," he said without preamble. "Another community, bigger than the one we escaped from. And Hannah, I think they've been recruiting from law enforcement and social services for years." Hannah felt her pulse quicken, and she wasn't sure if it was from fear or anticipation. "Where?" "Tennessee, remote area near the Smoky Mountains. Local sheriff's department has been covering for them, probably has converted personnel in key positions." David's voice carried a new quality, focused, predatory, completely confident. "I'm putting together a team to investigate." Official team? Unofficial. People who understand what we're dealing with, who won't be surprised by the capabilities these communities have developed. Hannah realized what he was really saying. David was recruiting people like them, converted individuals who could match the mountain community's enhanced abilities and predatory instincts. He was building a hunting pack to go after other hunting packs. "When do we start?" she asked, and knew as she said it that she had crossed a line from which there would be no return. "Tomorrow night. I'll send you the details." David paused. "Hannah, once we do this, once we start using what we've become for this kind of work, there's no going back to normal." "I know." Hannah looked out her apartment window at the city below, at all the people going about their normal lives, unaware that predators like her were walking among them. "I don't think normal was ever really an option." After she hung up, Hannah spent the evening preparing. She cleaned her hiking gear, checked her equipment, and tried to convince herself that what she was about to do was justified, that hunting the hunters was somehow different from becoming one of them. But as she fell asleep that night, her dreams were filled with the sound of whistling echoing through dark forests, and she couldn't tell if it was a warning or a welcome home. The Tennessee operation was supposed to be surveillance only, locate the community, assess their capabilities, gather intelligence for a larger federal response. Hannah knew David was lying even as he briefed the team. She could smell the deception on him, could hear the subtle changes in his voice that indicated he was planning something far more direct than observation. The team he'd assembled was exactly what she'd expected. 6 people, all with backgrounds in law enforcement or military service, all with the same barely controlled predatory energy that marked the converted. They'd been recruited from different agencies in different cases, but they all shared the same careful way of moving, the same heightened awareness, the same hunger lurking behind professional facades. Official records show this community has been operating since the mid-1980s, David explained, spreading topographical maps across the table in their motel room. Local law enforcement considers the area off-limits due to hazardous terrain and wildlife protection concerns. But satellite imagery shows structures, vehicle access, and what looks like agricultural activity. Agent Lisa Park, formerly DEA, pointed to a series of symbols marked on the map. These markings match what we found at sites in Kentucky and West Virginia. Same territorial markers, same patrol patterns. We're definitely looking at part of the larger network. Hannah studied the map and felt her enhanced senses picking up details the others had missed. The trail system wasn't random. It was designed to funnel people toward specific areas, to create kill zones where isolated hikers could be ambushed and captured. She could read the tactical layout with an instinctive understanding that would have been impossible before her conversion. "How many people?" asked Marcus Webb, a former Marine who'd been exposed to similar compounds during a case in North Carolina. "Estimated 40 to 60 adults, unknown number of children," David replied. "But we have to assume they have the same enhanced capabilities we've seen elsewhere, better than normal humans in every measurable category." Hannah felt a familiar stirring in her chest, not fear, but anticipation. The prospect of facing worthy opponents in their own territory was triggering responses that had nothing to do with law enforcement and everything to do with the hunter she was becoming. They moved out before dawn, hiking in through terrain that would have challenged normal humans but posed no significant obstacles for their enhanced group. Hannah found herself automatically taking point, using her improved senses to scout ahead and identify potential ambush sites. The forest felt familiar in ways that had nothing to do with her previous hiking experience. The enhanced awareness that came with conversion allowed her to read sign and track movement with instincts that felt ancient, predatory. She was becoming something that belonged in these mountains, something that understood the rules of survival that normal humans had forgotten. 3 hours into the approach, she found the first marker, a carved tree symbol that looked like a warning. But instead of the crude markings she'd seen before, this carving was elaborate, artistic, worked into the natural growth patterns of the bark with a skill that suggested decades of practice. "They've been here longer than the records indicate," she whispered into her radio. "This carving is old, maybe 20 years or more." David's voice crackled back. "How can you tell?" Hannah found herself answering with knowledge she didn't remember acquiring. Bark growth patterns, weathering of the cuts, the way the tree is healed around the edges. You can read the age of markings if you know what to look for. She realized the other team members were looking at her with expressions that mixed respect and wariness. Her conversion was more advanced than theirs, and it was beginning to show in ways that went beyond enhanced physical capabilities. They continued deeper into the territory, following game trails that showed signs of human modification. Someone had been improving these paths for years, creating a transportation network that was invisible to normal observation, but perfectly suited for the kind of enhanced humans they were becoming. By midday, they'd reached a ridgeline that overlooked the valley containing the community. What Hannah saw below challenged every assumption she'd made about the mountain settlements. This wasn't a primitive survivalist camp. The buildings were well constructed, with solar panels and modern communications equipment visible on several rooftops. Gardens showed sophisticated permaculture design, and she could see vehicles that ranged from military surplus trucks to late-model SUVs. Most disturbing of all was the size of the population. David's estimate of 40 to 60 adults had been conservative. Hannah counted at least 100 people moving through the settlement, with age ranges that suggested this community had been successfully reproducing for generations. "This isn't just a cult hiding in the mountains," Marcus whispered. "This is a parallel society." Hannah was studying the activity patterns below when her enhanced hearing picked up something that made her blood freeze. Whistling, the same complex, coordinated communication system she'd learned to fear during her captivity. But this whistling was different, more sophisticated, with layers of meaning that suggested decades of evolution. "They know we're here," she said. David looked at her sharply. "How do you know?" "Listen." Hannah pointed toward the valley. "They're coordinating a response. Whatever surveillance system they have, it detected our approach." The other team members strained to hear what Hannah was picking up effortlessly. To their less enhanced senses, the sounds might have been normal forest noise. But Hannah could distinguish individual voices, could track the movement of people through the settlement, could even identify emotional undertones that suggested the community was shifting from normal activity to tactical awareness. "We need to withdraw," Agent Park said. "This was supposed to be surveillance only, and we're obviously compromised." But David was studying the settlement with an expression Hannah recognized, the same focused hunger she felt when the predatory instincts took hold. "No, this is our chance to gather real intelligence. We'll never get another opportunity like this." Hannah realized David wasn't thinking like a federal agent anymore. He was thinking like a hunter who'd found a rival pack on his territory. The conversion process had progressed further in him than she'd realized, and the official mission was becoming secondary to more primitive imperatives. "David," she said carefully, "we're outnumbered 10 to 1, on their ground, with their advantages. This isn't a fight we can win." "It's not about winning," David replied, and Hannah heard the same tone she'd heard from Mother Sarah, the absolute certainty of someone who'd moved beyond normal human moral frameworks. "It's about sending a message." The other team members were looking increasingly uncomfortable as they recognized the shift in David's priorities. They were all fighting the same battle against their conversion symptoms, but David was losing that fight faster than the rest of them. Hannah made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Instead of trying to talk David down, instead of calling for extraction, she found herself evaluating the tactical situation with the same predatory focus he was showing. The settlement had obvious defensive advantages, but it also had weaknesses. The enhanced hearing that let her eavesdrop on their communications worked both ways. She could coordinate the team's movements while monitoring enemy responses. Her improved night vision would give them advantages in a nocturnal approach. And most importantly, the community below wasn't expecting to face opponents with the same enhanced capabilities they possessed. "There's a way," she heard herself saying, "but it's not a law enforcement operation anymore. It's a hunt." David smiled, and Hannah saw that his teeth had begun to sharpen, a physical change she hadn't noticed before. "What do you have in mind?" As Hannah began outlining a plan that involved systematically eliminating the community's leadership and driving the survivors into carefully prepared kill zones, she realized she had crossed the final line between human and monster. She was no longer trying to arrest criminals or gather evidence for prosecution. She was planning the systematic extermination of a rival predator pack. And the most terrifying part was how natural it felt, how right the planning process seemed when approached from a hunter's perspective rather than a law enforcement officer's training. By sunset, they were ready to begin what would later be classified as the Tennessee Incident, an operation that would leave 43 people dead and establish Hannah and David as the most effective and most dangerous assets in the federal government's war against the mountain communities. But as they prepared to move into position, Hannah caught a scent on the evening breeze that stopped her cold. It was familiar, triggering memories from her captivity that she'd tried to suppress. Someone from the original community was here, someone who had survived the federal raid and made it to this secondary location. The hunt was about to become personal in ways she hadn't anticipated. Hannah identified the scent during their final approach to the settlement. Guide, the tall, elongated figure who had been her primary captor, was somewhere in the valley below. The recognition triggered a response that was part memory, part instinct, and entirely predatory. "Contact from the first sight," she whispered into her radio. "Guide is here." David's voice carried a new edge. "You're certain?" "Chemical signature doesn't lie. He's in the main building, probably briefing their leadership on federal capabilities." Hannah found herself analyzing the tactical implications with cold efficiency. "He'll have told them about our enhanced abilities, our training, our weaknesses." The presence of Guide changed everything. This wasn't just surveillance or even a precision strike against an isolated community. It was a direct confrontation with someone who understood exactly what they'd become and how to counter their abilities. Marcus positioned himself on the northern approach and reported movement in the perimeter guard posts. "They're going to full defensive posture." Agent Park, covering the eastern approach, added, "Vehicle engines starting up. Looks like they're preparing for evacuation." Hannah realized the community was implementing the same dispersal protocol she'd witnessed during the raid on the original settlement. But this time they had advance warning and better preparation. If the team was going to accomplish anything, it had to be now, before the targets scattered to secondary locations throughout the mountains. "Change of plan," David announced over the radio. "We're going in hard and fast. No survivors." The casual order to commit mass murder should have triggered every ethical safeguard in Hannah's professional training. Instead, she found herself calculating angles of approach and estimating kill counts with the same dispassionate analysis she'd once applied to child welfare cases. "Rules of engagement?" Marcus asked. "No rules," David replied. "They're not human anymore, and neither are we. This is what we were made for." Hannah moved into position on the southern slope, where her enhanced night vision gave her clear lines of sight into the settlement's central area. Through her scope, she could see people moving with the same predatory grace she'd learned to recognize, coordinating their defensive preparations with hand signals and whistle calls. But as she watched, Hannah noticed something that made her reconsider the entire operation. Children, real children, not the modified offspring of long-term residents, were being moved into defensive positions alongside the adults. Kids who looked normal, human, recently captured. "David," she called softly into her radio. There are unmodified children down there, recent acquisitions. I see them." David's voice carried no change in tone, no indication that the presence of innocent victims had altered his tactical assessment. "Acceptable losses." The words hit Hannah like a physical blow. She was looking at children who were probably in the same situation she'd been in just weeks ago, victims of the community's recruitment activities, people who deserved rescue, not execution. And David was classifying them as acceptable casualties in his personal war against the converted. For the first time since her conversion began, Hannah felt the human part of her consciousness reassert itself with crystal clarity. The predatory instincts were still there, the enhanced abilities still functioned, but her moral framework snapped back into focus with jarring intensity. She was about to become complicit in the murder of innocent children, not to mention the fact that many of the adults in the community below might be victims themselves, people who had been converted against their will, whose enhanced aggression and hunting behavior were the result of chemical manipulation rather than conscious choice. "I can't do this," she said into her radio. David's response was immediate. "You can and you will. We all will. This is what we are now." "No," Hannah said, and surprised herself with the firmness in her voice. "This is what they wanted us to become. This is the final stage of the conversion, turning us into killers who target our own species." She could hear David's breathing over the radio, could sense the other team members waiting for direction. The moment balanced on a knife's edge between continuing the mission and calling it off. "Hannah's right," Agent Park finally said. "If we do this, we're not law enforcement anymore. We're just another predator pack." Marcus agreed. "Mission abort. We extract the children and gather intelligence for a proper federal response." But David's voice, when it came over the radio, carried a tone Hannah had never heard before, something that wasn't quite human anymore. "Anyone who doesn't participate in this operation is a liability. The children below aren't victims, their food sources being prepared for conversion, and any team member who can't recognize that fact has compromised judgment." Hannah realized David was threatening to turn on his own team. The conversion process had progressed so far in him that he saw opposition to the mission as evidence of incomplete transformation, of retained human weakness that needed to be eliminated. She was making a decision about how to respond when the choice was taken away from her. Movement in the settlement below caught her attention. Guide himself, emerging from the main building and looking directly toward her position despite the darkness and concealment. Their eyes met across 500 yards of mountainous terrain, and Hannah understood that Guide had been tracking her scent just as she'd been tracking his. The elongated figure raised one hand in what might have been a greeting or might have been a challenge, then opened his mouth and produced a sound that carried clearly across the valley. It wasn't the whistle call she'd learned to fear. It was something else, something that resonated in her bones and triggered responses she didn't understand. Other voices joined in from throughout the settlement, dozens of them, creating a harmony that seemed to bypass her ears and speak directly to the predatory instincts the conversion had awakened. Hannah found herself wanting to respond, to add her voice to the call. The urge was almost overwhelming, and she realized this was how the community communicated with converted individuals, not through language or radio transmissions, but through something more primitive, more fundamental. "Do you hear that?" Marcus whispered over the radio. "I hear it," David replied, and his voice carried a note of hunger that made Hannah's skin crawl. "It's a hunting call. They're inviting us to join them." The sound continued, rising and falling in patterns that seemed to carry complex meanings. Hannah could sense her team members responding to it, could feel their carefully maintained human facades beginning to slip as the call awakened their converted nature. "We need to leave," she said urgently. "Now, before we lose control completely." But it was too late. Agent Park was already moving down the slope toward the settlement, drawn by instincts that were stronger than her professional training. Marcus followed, his movements becoming more fluid, more predatory with each step. David's laughter carried over the radio. Finally, we can stop pretending to be something we're not." Hannah watched her team descend toward the valley, abandoning their human identities for the promise of belonging to something that understood their true nature. The call from below intensified, welcoming them home to a community that had been waiting for converted law enforcement officers to join their ranks. She was the only one left on the ridge, the only one still fighting the urge to answer the call and embrace what she'd become. Below her, the settlement was preparing to welcome new members who would bring federal resources and expertise to their operations. Hannah realized she was witnessing the real purpose of the conversion process, not just to create individual predators, but to systematically infiltrate and corrupt the agencies tasked with stopping them. David and the others would return to federal service with enhanced abilities and completely compromised loyalties, perfectly positioned to protect the mountain communities from government interference. She had perhaps minutes before her own resistance crumbled completely. The call was getting stronger, more appealing, promising relief from the constant struggle to maintain her humanity in the face of overwhelming predatory instincts. Hannah made the hardest decision of her life. She pulled out the emergency transponder David had disabled at the beginning of the mission, activated its distress signal, and began transmitting their coordinates to federal authorities. Then she started down the slope toward the settlement, not to join the others, but to do whatever damage she could before the conversion finally claimed her completely. If she was going to become a monster, she was going to be a monster that protected innocent people rather than preying on them. The whistle call rose to meet her as she descended into the valley, and Hannah added her voice to the harmony while her finger found the trigger of her weapon. Hannah reached the perimeter of the settlement as the federal response team arrived. The timing wasn't coincidental. She'd coordinated her descent to coincide with the air support she'd summoned, turning what should have been a infiltration into a three-way battle between converted federal agents, the mountain community, and normal human law enforcement trying to make sense of an impossible situation. Chaos erupted across the valley as helicopters swept in with searchlights and loudspeakers, their crews expecting to find either hostages or a standard raid scenario. Instead, they encountered David and his team moving through the settlement with predatory efficiency, systematically eliminating anyone who posed a threat to their integration with the community. Hannah watched David tear out a community member's throat with his bare hands while Agent Park used enhanced speed and agility to hunt down fleeing civilians. The conversion had completed itself during their descent. They were no longer law enforcement officers using necessary force, but apex predators reveling in the opportunity to kill. The arriving federal teams had no framework for understanding what they were seeing. Radio chatter filled with confused reports. Agents on scene are engaging friendlies. Repeat, our people are attacking the civilians, requesting immediate support and medical evaluation. Hannah found herself in the unique position of being the only converted individual who retained enough human consciousness to understand all three factions in the developing battle. She could track the movement of community members through enhanced senses, could predict the tactical responses of the federal teams through professional training, and could anticipate David's team through shared experience with the conversion process. Most importantly, she could still identify the innocent victims who needed protection. She moved through the settlement using abilities that felt both foreign and natural, her enhanced agility allowing her to navigate the chaos while normal humans stumbled through darkness and confusion. The whistle calls of the community members guided her toward the central building where Guide had taken shelter with what appeared to be a group of recently captured hikers. Hannah found them in what had once been a storage room, 7 people in hiking gear, none showing signs of conversion, all obviously terrified by the violence erupting around them. Guide stood over them with a weapon, but his attention was focused on the battle outside rather than his prisoners. When Hannah entered the room, Guide turned with the fluid motion she remembered from her own captivity. His elongated features showed no surprise at her presence, and when he spoke, his voice carried the strange harmonic quality that marked advanced conversion. "You came back," he said. "I told Mother Sarah you would. The call is too strong for people like us to resist." Hannah studied his face, looking for some trace of the human being he must have been before the conversion process claimed him. But whatever person he'd been originally was buried too deep to reach, replaced by something that saw other humans only as resources to be harvested. "I came back to finish what the federal raid started," Hannah replied. Guide smiled, and she could see that his teeth had grown sharper since their last encounter. "You think you're still human. You think you can fight what you've become. But look around you. Your teammates have already accepted their true nature. They're hunting alongside us now, as they were always meant to. Through the walls, Hannah could hear the sound of David's voice raised in the same whistle call that had drawn them down from the ridge. He was communicating with the community members in their own language, coordinating the slaughter of the federal response teams. Some conversions are more complete than others, Hannah admitted, but that doesn't mean we have to become what you are. Guide gestured toward the captives huddled on the floor. Fresh recruits, young, healthy, isolated from family connections that might complicate their integration. In 6 months, they'll be hunting alongside us. In a year, they'll look back on their human lives with disgust at their own weakness. Hannah looked at the prisoners and saw herself weeks ago, terrified, confused, completely unprepared for the reality of what these communities represented. The only difference was that she'd had federal intervention to prevent her complete conversion. These people would have no such rescue. Let them go, Hannah said. Why? So you can pretend you're still one of them? You're not, Hannah. You can smell their fear, can't you? You can hear their elevated heart rates, can track their movement through chemical signatures they're leaving in the air. When you look at them, what's your first instinct? Hannah realized Guide was right about her sensory responses. She could indeed smell fear pheromones, could track individual scents, could evaluate each prisoner's physical capabilities with predatory assessment. But beneath the enhanced perception, her human consciousness remained intact enough to see them as people who deserved protection. My first instinct is to get them to safety, she said. Guide laughed, a sound that wasn't entirely human anymore. Your first instinct is to evaluate them as prey. Everything else is learned behavior, social conditioning that becomes weaker every day as your true nature reasserts itself. The building shook as explosions erupted outside, federal teams using heavy ordnance to deal with opponents whose capabilities exceeded normal human limits. Hannah could hear David's team coordinating with community members to mount a defense that utilized enhanced agility and sensory abilities to maximum advantage. The battle outside won't last much longer, Guide continued. Your people are outnumbered and outmatched. When it's over, we'll integrate the survivors and eliminate the rest. Including you, if you insist on fighting your own nature. Hannah made her choice. She raised her weapon and fired 3 rounds center mass, watching Guide's elongated form crumple to the floor. The conversion process might have given him enhanced abilities, but it hadn't made him bulletproof. The prisoners screamed and scrambled away from Guide's body, but Hannah was already moving to secure the room's other entrance. Through her enhanced hearing, she could track multiple contacts approaching, community members responding to the gunshots, coming to investigate Guide's death. "Who are you?" one of the prisoners asked. A young woman, probably college age, wearing gear that suggested she'd been on a weekend hiking trip when she was captured. "Federal agent," Hannah replied automatically, though the words felt increasingly hollow. "I'm going to get you out of here." She guided the group toward what her enhanced senses indicated was the least defended exit route, but their movement was slow and clumsy compared to what she'd become accustomed to. Normal humans seemed almost handicapped in comparison to converted individuals, their senses limited, their reflexes slow, their awareness of their environment painfully restricted. The contrast made it clear why the mountain communities saw unconverted people as prey rather than equals. From a converted perspective, normal humans were simply an inferior species, as different from them as deer were from wolves. But Hannah forced herself to remember that the enhanced abilities came with a price. The gradual erosion of everything that made life meaningful beyond simple survival and dominance. The community members she'd observed were efficient predators, but they'd lost the capacity for art, for love, for the complex emotional experiences that defined human existence. They reached the building's rear exit as community members breached the front entrance. Hannah could hear them discovering Guide's body, could track their response through whistle calls that coordinated pursuit. Her group had perhaps a 5-minute head start before enhanced trackers began following their scent trail. "Can you run?" she asked the prisoners. "Where?" The young woman looked around at the forest surrounding the settlement. "We don't know this area. We'll get lost." Hannah realized the prisoners were right to be scared. The terrain was difficult even for someone with enhanced abilities, and normal humans would be helpless in the dark forest. Worse, the entire region was controlled by community members who could track them effortlessly and had decades of experience hunting in this environment. The sound of helicopter rotors grew louder as federal air support attempted to establish control over the battle zone. But the pilots were struggling with the same electromagnetic interference that had plagued previous operations, and their communications were fragmenting into static and confusion. Hannah made a decision that surprised even her. Instead of trying to guide the prisoners through hostile territory to an uncertain rescue, she activated her emergency transponder and began broadcasting their location directly to federal forces. "What are you doing?" the young woman asked. "Calling for extraction." Hannah watched the settlement central building erupt in flames as federal incendiary rounds found their target. But it's going to get worse before it gets better. Through her enhanced senses, Hannah could track the approach of community members closing in on their position. 3 groups, moving with coordinated precision, using the same hunting tactics she'd observed during her captivity. They had perhaps 2 minutes before the pursuit arrived. She could also hear David's voice over the radio frequencies the federal teams were using, providing tactical information to community defenders while maintaining the pretense of being an undercover federal agent. His conversion was so complete that he was actively betraying his own species while believing he was serving a higher purpose. The irony wasn't lost on Hannah. She was the most converted member of the original team, the one with the most advanced physical changes and predatory instincts, but she was also the only one still fighting to protect normal humans rather than prey on them. As community members closed in and federal helicopters struggled to maintain position in the electromagnetic interference field, Hannah realized she faced a choice that would define not just her own future, but the fate of everyone she was trying to protect. She could surrender to the conversion completely, join the community members in hunting down the prisoners, and live the rest of her life as an apex predator in a sustainable ecosystem designed around human predation. Or she could fight to the end to protect people who would always see her as a monster, knowing that victory would mean a lifetime of struggling against instincts that grew stronger every day. Hannah looked at the terrified faces of the people she was trying to save, then at the forest where her former teammates were learning to embrace their true nature, then at the burning settlement where a way of life was being destroyed by people who didn't understand what they were fighting. She made her choice and began to whistle. 6 months later, Dr. Rebecca Walsh found Hannah in the secure wing of the CDC facility in Atlanta, sitting by the reinforced window that overlooked the research complex. The converted agent looked healthy, better than healthy actually, with the kind of perfect physical conditioning that came from enhanced metabolism and improved muscle coordination. "How are you feeling today?" Dr. Walsh asked, taking the chair across from her patient. "Same as yesterday, same as I'll feel tomorrow." Hannah's voice carried the harmonic undertones that marked advanced conversion, but her responses remained lucid, cooperative. "The cravings are manageable. The enhanced senses are stable. No change in psychological status." Dr. Walsh made notes on her tablet. After 6 months of study, Hannah remained their only example of a converted individual who had retained functional human consciousness. The rest of David's team had been killed during the Tennessee operation, along with most of the community members they'd tried to join. "The review board is meeting next week to discuss your long-term status," Dr. Walsh said. "There's been some discussion about limited release under supervision." Hannah turned from the window to meet the doctor's eyes. "You mean they want to use me?" "The federal government is facing a growing threat from the mountain communities. Your insights into their capabilities and psychology have been invaluable for developing countermeasures." Hannah smiled, and Dr. Walsh noticed, not for the first time, that her patient's teeth had continued to sharpen during her months in custody. "You want me to hunt them?" "We want you to help us protect innocent people from groups that see them as prey. And you think I'm different from those groups because I chose to protect the prisoners instead of joining the hunt?" Hannah's laugh carried no humor. "Dr. Walsh, I made that choice for exactly the same reason a wolf might protect sheep from other wolves, to preserve my own food source." Dr. Walsh felt a familiar chill. These were the moments when Hannah's conversion showed most clearly, when the thing wearing her patient's face revealed perspectives that were fundamentally inhuman. "You don't mean that, don't I? When I look at normal humans now, I see prey animals with delusions of apex predator status, slow, weak, limited in senses and awareness, completely dependent on tools and social structures for survival." Hannah turned back to the window. The only reason I protect them is because I remember being one of them, and some part of me thinks that matters. And the part of you that thinks it matters gets smaller every day." Hannah was quiet for a moment. "The conversion isn't a one-time event, Dr. Walsh. It's an ongoing process. Every day I spend in this facility, every interaction with normal humans, every reminder of what I used to be, it all reinforces the separation between what I am now and what I was." Dr. Walsh made more notes, documenting the progression of psychological changes that had been occurring despite all their attempts at intervention. They tried every form of therapy, every pharmaceutical approach, every experimental treatment available. Nothing had slowed the process by which Hannah was becoming something that was no longer entirely human. "The children from Tennessee have all been successfully reintegrated," Dr. Walsh said, changing the subject. "The 7 you rescued are back with their families, receiving counseling, showing no signs of conversion symptoms." "Good." Hannah's response seemed genuine. "They deserve normal lives." "Do you ever regret the choice you made, walking away from the community, from the chance to be part of something that understood your new nature?" Hannah was quiet for so long that Dr. Walsh began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a sadness that seemed entirely human despite the harmonic undertones. "Every day. The community offered belonging, purpose, a place where I wouldn't have to pretend to be something I'm not. They offered the chance to embrace what I'd become instead of fighting it." She gestured toward the window, toward the world beyond the facility. "Out there, I'll always be a monster pretending to be human. With them, I could have been human evolving into something better. But you chose to stay human." "I chose to try to stay human. I'm not sure I succeeded." Hannah met Dr. Walsh's eyes again. "When the review board meets next week, they're going to approve my release. Not because they think I'm cured, but because they need what I've become." Dr. Walsh tried to keep her expression neutral, but Hannah's enhanced senses picked up the micro-expressions that confirmed her suspicion. "The mountain communities are spreading," Hannah continued. "New sites in Virginia, Kentucky, possibly Georgia. Each one more sophisticated than the last. Each one better at converting law enforcement personnel and government officials. The federal response has been ineffective because normal humans can't match their capabilities." "So, you're saying the government needs monsters to fight monsters?" "I'm saying evolution doesn't care about human morality. The mountain communities represent a successful adaptation to environmental pressures. They're more efficient predators. They reproduce sustainably. They've created social structures that can survive in conditions where normal human civilization fails." Hannah's voice took on the lecturing tone she'd once used in social work presentations. "Fighting them with conventional methods is like trying to hunt wolves with house cats." Dr. Walsh realized she was listening to Hannah make the case for her own deployment as a weapon against the communities, not because she wanted to hunt them, but because she understood that the alternative was allowing them to continue expanding until they overwhelmed normal human society. "And you're willing to be that weapon?" "I'm willing to be useful. The alternative is spending the rest of my life in facilities like this one, becoming more inhuman every day while serving no purpose beyond scientific curiosity." Hannah stood and moved to the window again. "At least if I'm hunting other predators, the deterioration of my humanity serves a constructive purpose." A soft chime indicated visiting hours were ending. Dr. Walsh gathered her materials and prepared to leave, but Hannah's voice stopped her at the door. "Doctor, when I'm released next week, when I start working operations against the communities, I want you to know that I'll remember this conversation. I'll remember that you tried to help me hold on to my humanity, even when it became clear that was a losing battle. Why are you telling me this?" Hannah smiled again, and this time Dr. Walsh saw something in her expression that was neither human nor monster, something that might have been gratitude or might have been pity. "Because when I complete my conversion, when I become everything the communities wanted me to be, I want someone to remember that I chose to protect the people who made me instead of hunting them. It may be the only human thing left about me by then." Dr. Walsh left the facility that evening with a report that would recommend Hannah's release for special operations duty, not because she believed Hannah was cured or safe, but because she understood that monsters created by human monsters might be the only defense against the spreading infection of inhuman evolution. 3 days later, Hannah was transferred to a black site facility in Virginia, where she began training with a new team of converted agents, people like herself who had retained enough human consciousness to serve as weapons against their own kind. The war for the future of human evolution had begun, and Hannah Carlisle was no longer sure which side she wanted to win. But on quiet nights, when the facility's security systems picked up distant sounds that might have been wind or might have been whistling, Hannah would find herself listening with enhanced senses and remembering a valley in the mountains where people had learned to embrace what they really were. And sometimes, despite everything, she would whistle back,